Hey everybody, it's Saturday, and that means that it's time to start what I hope will be the first of a series of weekly development diaries between now and about March or April of next year. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about a tabletop role playing game which I'm developing, which I've talked about in previous videos on this channel, called Amboria Role Playing in the World Under Starlight. And the World Under Starlight, as you probably know if you've been watching my channel or paying attention to anything I posted on social media, is a fantasy world that I've been working on for about the last 20 years and running games in for about the last 6 years. So it didn't start out as a tabletop role-playing setting. It started out as my own private fantasy world. I'm sure many of us had done something like that. And then eventually some of my friends said, hey, why don't you run a game for us in Amboria? So we've been doing that, and enough people have heard about it and liked it, and it's got enough traction that I'm very excited to say we are going to be publishing the first a core book and an adventure book, both in a proprietary system called the Clash system, as well as in the OGL for those of you who like D&D 5th edition rules. And those will be coming out from Strange Owl Games via Kickstarter in probably April or May of next year. So stay tuned for that, and the best way to stay tuned for that is just to watch these development diaries where I'm going to talk about, well, really whatever I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about game design. I'm going to talk about the world under Starlight and how I built it, or what I'm doing as I build it, and things like that. And hopefully it'll be a chance to peek under the hood. Sometimes if I don't have anything to talk about, maybe I'll just read to you and read you some of the stories, some of the poetry, some of the lore, so you can get a taste for whether or not this is something you're interested in. I thought we'd start out today with a very quick video, and I'm going to try to keep these all to 10 minutes or less, talking about food. So I think that food is a really important part of the fantasy genre. I grew up reading books like hold on, got it right here next to me. I grew up reading books like the Chronicles of Narnia. This is not a great book to hold up because the cover, the dust jacket, is missing. But this is my all-in-one Narnia. I have several copies of the Chronicles of Narnia around the house because I have a lot of children, and I want good books to be available to them. Kids there's certain things you have to read for school and etc. But I also like to just have good books lying around so that kids will pick them up and discover them on their own, so then they think it's their idea. Earlier this year, my kids got really into the Lord of the Rings. Some of you know that I'm a big Tolkien nerd. I'm to the point of being a published Tolkien scholar, and I even have a podcast called the Amon Podcast if you want to hear me talk about Tolkien every month. So love Tolkien. But I've been very careful not to sort of force it on my children. But recently, my daughters discovered the Lord of the Rings, got really into it, and then we watched the movies together, and then they read the Silmarillion together, and now they're just super into Tolkien, and they feel like it was their idea. So, pro tip for those of you who are parents. But anyway, so in the Chronicles, so I grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia. I grew up reading the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and then other fantasy series like the Prydain Chronicles. I didn't actually really get into Redwall when I was young. I don't know why that was, because I had a lot of friends who were into it. But so I just grew up reading stuff like this, especially Narnia, especially Lord of the Rings, which I just reread over and over and over again. And one of the things that really stands out in these works of classic fantasy, and something which seems to have been understood very well by J.K. Rowling when she was writing the Harry Potter books, which I haven't read very much of, but the bits that I have read and seen and heard discussed, this seems to be the case. One of the most important things about this era of classic fantasy is the use of food, right? Use of food to kind of ground the story, but also to kind of fill the world out and make it feel like it's a real place. Now, what do I mean by grounding the story? Let's say that fantasy worlds are full of obviously fantastic things beyond our experience in the real world, and typically speaking, these are things that we can only understand by analogy, right? A really common way is to understand this is in with something like a centaur, right? We know what a man is like. We know what a horse is like. So the combination of those two things, maybe that's a little harder to understand. But if you look at centaurs in literature, like classical Greek mythology, right? They have the qualities of man, so they're smart and very smart. They're very wise. And capable of medicine and astronomy and all these things, but also They have the qualities of horses, and specifically stallions. I don't know if you grew, if you didn't grow up on a farm, or you've never seen horses, a stallion around mares that are in heat. You don't know what this is about, but let's just say that don't invite centaurs to your wedding because things get a little messy in Greek mythology, and that's because they have the mind of a man, and so they're capable of wisdom and like rational thought, but they have the belly and the impulses and the let's say animal drives of a horse. So that's an example of something that's like fantastical, but we can understand it by analogy and kind of unpack the symbolism of it. But another way that we really ground a fantasy setting is by tying it to things that are, let's say, it's related to this. It's not quite by analogy. It's stuff that's really familiar, right? So none of us have been to, Middle Earth, or although you could say that we live in Middle Earth, but that's another video. But none of us have been to Middle Earth. None of us have been to Narnia. But we've all had a breakfast of bacon and eggs, right? And so when Bilbo wakes up each morning thinking about how much he would like to be back in his hobbit hole having bacon, and this comes up over and over again in The Hobbit, right? That the thing that Bilbo really misses about being on the road is bacon, specifically bacon and eggs. And we all know that feeling, and we all know, the feeling of like a morning you didn't get breakfast, or you didn't think you needed it, and then you're out somewhere and you smell like something greasy kind of cooking, and how it's, you suddenly realize, oh man, I wish I'd eaten a meal. We've all had that experience, and so food grounds it, and ultimately, also on a deeper level, the food in fantasy stories is part of the sacramentality of the genre. This is something that I talk about quite a bit when I go places to speak at conferences and so on. But there's something called the sacramental imagination, and the sacramental imagination is kind of the basis of fantasy storytelling, and specifically Christian fantasy storytelling. It's something that goes back to George MacDonald, and obviously Tolkien and Lewis and other writers like them. Basically, sacramental imagination is very simple. It's the ability to conceive of a world in which common things can be the medium or the mediator of grace. For grace, you could say magic, but you could also just say something beyond magic, something kind of ineffable, something it's hard to describe, but we've all experienced, hopefully, at one or more points in our lives. And of course, in Christianity, in the Christian religion, I'm an Orthodox Christian, as I think most people know. In Christianity, one of the primary mediums of grace, the ways that grace comes to us, is in the Eucharist, which is physical bread and physical wine, which is then transformed to become the body and blood of Christ. And by partaking of that food, we become the recipients of grace. And so the sacramental imagination is being able to understand or conceive of a world in which this is true. And I think it's one of the most potent things that you get from fantasy stories is how very common things like a meal, right, that home cooked meal, that breakfast that Bilbo is missing but he keeps thinking back to, right, a meal, a drink, something as wholesome as homemade beer or the finest wine, things like this have the potential to really enliven us and to kind of ground us back to a world where things are less industrialized and things are less processed, and where things are less fake and artificial, right? And that's one of the main things that we get from fantasy stories, is that grounding and that return to the earth, right? To really see nature as nature, that's the first step to seeing nature as a means to knowing God. So I think that food in fantasy stories is really important. It's one of the main facets of the genre. So in my own storytelling, and particularly in the way that I run tabletop role-playing games, food is really important. If you have a group of adventurers walks into an inn, they walk into a tavern, I don't want them to just eat and one of them asks what is on the menu, which is a common question in my own games because my players know I'm really into this, and I describe food very vividly. By the way, I also love to cook, as does my wife. We're pretty good cooks, I think, and I like to make elaborate meals that take lots and lots of time and preparation, and I like to have people over friends, but also people I would just like to be friends with and share those meals with them. To me, that's one of the most satisfying things that you can do. Um, so, where was I going with this? So, in a tabletop game, if a player says, "Well, what's on the menu?" I don't want to give them just a generic, "Oh, there's a leg of mutton. There's you can get bread, you can get mutton, you can get beer, you can get potatoes or whatever." I don't want to give them something generic. I want to give them something that first of all sounds really appetizing, but also something that seems specific to the region, specific to the culture, right? The way a lot of DMs and GMs handle this, that I've seen, is like to have different varieties of wine and beer and things like that, drinks that are common to the region, but they don't always pay so much attention to the actual food. So this is my sort of my commitment, is that as I'm writing adventures for the world under Starlight, that each locality will have some menus that the lore master, which is what we call the game master or the dungeon master in this game, they're called the lore master, which is a term I like better anyway. But there will be some menus that are specific to the region that the lore master can use to help the players feel like they're really there. It's going to increase the immersion, and then also ultimately just make the experience of playing the world and being in the world more refreshing, and maybe reignite a love of food that's beyond just consumption, that's beyond just junk food in the players themselves. Ultimately, I hope that reading these adventures, playing through these adventures, going through them with your table is a, I don't want to say redemptive experience, because that's putting more on a game than a game can hold, but I hope it's like the experience of reading your favorite fantasy novel, where you kind of come away feeling refreshed, renewed, and the real world, right? The world that you and I have to live in, that you can see more colors, that you can taste more things, that you say, you know what, instead of a TV dinner or a fast food tonight. I do love me some fast food, so I'm not, if you had to have fast food, I'm today or whatever, I'm not ragging on you, but instead of that, say, what if we sat down and we made something very simple but hearty? What if we tried to make something weird that we've never tried before? And I think that if we can change our relationship to food so that it's less about consumption and it's more about enjoyment, that could actually, among other things, do a lot for our health. So anyway, all that to say, I thought what I would do to close out this first development diary is read you a sample menu. Now, this is for Senkenkar, the Holy City, and this menu is in the very first adventure in the trilogy of adventures, which will come with the core book. And that adventure is called, this first adventure is called A Matter of Honor, which is actually a euphemism for something important. I'm not going to tell you what, though. You have to get the book. But I'm going to read to you the menu. So this is what you would get as the lore master, if one of your players chose to spend an evening at a Carolin, or the Carolina is the plural. It's the inns, literally the drinking houses, in the world, in the Amborian nation in the world under Starlight. And so if they chose to spend the evening at one in particular called the Listing Harkle, which is where the adventure begins, they can, says, the Carolina or the inns of Senkenkar are famous for their dinners, where a few silver stars can buy you a rich meal of many courses. Some characters may choose to spend their free evening at the sign of the Listing Harkle and enjoy good food and rich wine with the other patrons. If they do, a mere 5 silver stars gets them the following meal. First course, rice cakes, oysters, with a thin brown rice wine topping. At this point, they also bring out the dormice for the main course. Yes, dormice for the main course, and they weigh them live in front of the guests. This is a show of rich opulence. Second course is crabs and lobster dipped in oils that have been heavily spiced and then cooked. Shredded duck fat, creamy goat cheese, and apricot eaten on a bed of rice and served with a richer dark wine. The dormice, the ones that they were shown earlier, are also brought out now, having been cooked on a spit and then quartered, dipped in a rich brown chutney sauce. Dornamice, for people who don't know, were a favorite, and especially a favorite food of the Roman Empire, but also kind of a sign of decadence. So there's a historical precedent there. And then for dessert, a strong, pungent fruit brandy served in small glasses with a rich dish of stewed pears and peacock's flesh. There's also a large pie baked in the shape of an enormous swan. That actually has to do with a feast that is coming up, a religious feast that's coming up, but it's not an actual swan because eating swan's flesh in Amboria is actually a taboo. So they have a pie cooked in that shape, but they don't actually eat. They don't actually eat a swan. So that's a menu. There are actually in this adventure there are multiple menus, and it's optional content. You don't have to go there as a lore master, but if you do, your players are going to be more immersed in the world and also maybe have their horizons broadened a little bit. Maybe they'll try some food in real life that they wouldn't have before. I always know when I sit down and I read The Lord of the Rings or The Chronicles of Narnia or The Hobbit or something like that, I often come away thinking, you know what? You know what sounds nice? Bacon and eggs.